Hello and welcome to the video. This is my annual roundup of the split of FPV stuff that's in the hobby. Now, I've been doing this once every year, particularly around the August time frame, where I ask my audience what FPV system are you flying? Is it analog only? Is it a bit of analog and HD, or is it HD only? Or when I've got that result and we need to have a little bit more detail, I've asked what the split is, whether it's DJI, Walksnail, HD0. Now, over the last couple of years, it has been interesting to track the changes, and I thought it would be useful to kind of share with you what the results were and how they're changing from year to year, because they do speak to a couple of things that's going on in the hobby. Now, there are a couple of caveats that I need to go through before I get into too much detail here. The first one is that don't forget this is a single data point. This is me asking my audience once every year in August what they have, and the responses that I get will very much colour the reaction and also the audience. Other channels that are very much into HD0 might have a different audience with a slightly different skew. Other channels that are very into DJI might have different skew. Other channels that are very much into whoops and analog only flying might get a different view as well. However, the thing is that the position that I take on this stuff has not changed. It's consistent, and that is that none of these systems is perfect, including analog. The HD systems all have their own strengths and weaknesses, and there's no one system that is the answer to everyone's issues, and that's despite what some people might tell you in some of the videos. So let's go through some of the results. Let's remind ourselves what they were only 2 years ago, and it's amazing how much has changed in only 24 months. So the first time I asked this stuff was back in 2022, and back then the split was 60%. These are percentages in all of the slides I'm going to show you. 60% of pilots were still analog, 20% were flying analog and HD, and then 20% were HD only. Now, back in 2022, only 2 years ago, that really meant that it was the DJI system, the original DJI system, that had 100% of the market share. The other two systems that we're using now, things like Walksnail and HD0, weren't really kicking about in the same way that they are. Walksnail definitely hadn't been released. HD0 was around in a kind of embryonic form, and some people were flying it. But we'll just assume, because I didn't ask back then, the vast majority, over 95% to 100%, is going to be DJI V1. So that's how it looked only 2 years ago. However, if we then jump to 2023, this time last year, the split has changed a little bit. The number of analog only had dropped a little bit, and that's because the number of both HD and both had increased too. So although there'd been a slight drop in pilots who were just flying analog, there had been an uptick in the digital HD only stuff, and also those who had transitioned from analog into HD via flying a bit of both. Now, these numbers in the middle, the mix of both, are kind of interesting, because for me, that's how I've been for probably 3-4 years, ever since the DJI HD system came out, and actually before that, with even systems like the Connex Pro Sight, if you remember that. I was flying HD before even the DJI system came out, but those were for very specialized things. The airside units were very expensive. It was a faff to set up with the goggles back then. You had to have HDMI cables and all kind of gubbins. But what you tend to find is that pilots will start off as analog that have been in the hobby for a long time, dip their toe into the HD system, buy the set of goggles or a module or maybe one air unit that comes with it, and then dip their toe in the water. Once they've experienced HD, realize they love it, will start investing, and eventually will move on to the side of HD only. In the exception, though, there are exceptions, and that tends to be, from what I can see, around the whoops, where adding things like HD systems just pulls a huge amount of current, extra current from the battery, which has a massive increase on the flight time, adds a lot of additional weight, and I'm not sure what extra you get flying a little whoop with that. And that results in lots of pilots, even though they're fully HD for everything else, still keeping a set of analog goggles for their whoops and that style of flying. If we now look at the split between those things, we now have Walksnail and HD0 were kicking around last year. The split of the HD only pilots was really interesting. the DJI number had dropped and the overall market had probably increased a little bit as well. So the actual drop in real terms was probably not as big. But we saw that there was a very, very strong uptake of both walk snail and HD0, and that had dramatically affected DJI's position in the market, with them losing nearly half of their market share to these competitive systems. And I genuinely think that DJI panicked a little bit about that, which is why they eventually released the O3 Air unit systems, but also why they've been doing some of the dodgy stuff, telling resellers and RTF quad designers that they could only do stuff with the DJI kit. And the last set of results looked like this. In 2024, the reduction of Analogue continues, so Analogue only pilots are now at 38%, and interestingly, a mix of both, so the Analogue pilots moving into HD, or HD pilots keeping a little bit of Analogue around for their whoops. It's now at 31-31. You can definitely see there are some trends. But what about if we populate this one back here in the bottom right hand corner? Well, there we are. We have now the O3 system as well as the DJI V1. We can see that the DJI V1 system is continuing to fall away as people move on to the O3 units, the walk snail and HD0 units as well. We can see that walk snail has continued to grow. The growth from the initial year, where it went from basically 0 to 31%, it's grown another 8%, and the HD0, as I would say, probably about stayed the same, even though it's a different point. I think we have to be a little bit careful, as I said in the introduction. This is a single data point, so you can't read too much into this. We need a much larger sample on lots of different places. So what about if we stick those into a graph and try and figure out what this actually means? Well, this is looking at the FPV market split for all types. So we have Analogue, which is the blue line that goes from 60 to 48 to 38, reasonably solid line across all 3 years. We have a mix of both, which increased a little bit, then slackened off, and then digital HD only has actually increased the rate of adoption from 23 to 24. Now, I think that the Analogue reduction is pretty consistent, and lots of pilots are still using Analogue for that whoop stuff. I also think that the second-hand market, I know lots of people messaged me to say that they were getting into HD via the V1 goggles that we were flogging on places like eBay. They've upgraded the HD system to the DJI O3, and they've got rid of their version 1 kit, and that's been floating around and lots of people have been snapping that up. Personally, I think the new pilots for the HD systems are going to be coming from these Analogue-only pilots as they put their toe into the water with HD or move HD exclusively. I still can't see a compelling reason to swap from DJI to walk snail to HD0, or vice versa. They all have their strengths and weaknesses, but I don't think if you've already invested £1,000 or more pounds or dollars into a system, why you'd walk away from that investment. So what about the actual HD systems themselves? What do the splits look like? Well, it looks like this. Please remember that the DJI V1 system and the O3 system, which is the red line, they're both essentially the DJI pieces. Let's look at the DJI V1 stuff first. You can see that back in 2022, it was the only game in town for the majority of pilots, and you can see that that's continued to fall off, and you'd expect that it has essentially been replaced by the O3 unit. DJI very aggressively pushing the O3 stuff out at us to get people to buy new hardware, which is, let's be honest, how they make their money. And you can see that a lot of the drop from 23 to 24 in the V1 unit has been taken up with people moving onto the O3. So that's potentially some new pilots and some pilots upgrading their V1 stuff to get the advantages of the O3 Air units. Interestingly is the other two systems. Walk snail is the green line, so that started at 0, that wasn't around then, had a very strong initial introduction, lots of people jumping on walk snail, and then it has continued to grow, although at a much slower pace. And again, I reckon that the HD0 split is probably about the same. So what does this mean? Well, it means that the HD part of the hobby continues to grow. I think the overall market continues to grow generally anyway. And it looks like the lack of a really great option for whoops for the HD system means that Analogue is going to be here to stay. Even as people move into HD, they're going to keep a set of Analogue goggles around. Interesting that this is the first year where the gap between DJI and the other systems is really, really small. If we go back and look at the slide, you can see here that the combined DJI number went from 100%, where they pretty much owned the market, down to 55% in 2023, and now it is about 49% if you add both the V1 and the O3 numbers up. So as a market share, DJI, based on these numbers, is dropping slightly year on year as the other systems take market share away. And that growth seems to be coming from the walk snail system at the moment. Now, as I said in the introduction, none of these FPV systems are perfect. Analogue, you get the low resolution with things like the DJI system, walk snail and HD0. They all have their areas where they're particularly good, but have areas of weakness as well. And making sure that you pick the system that fits with the way you fly, the models that you fly, and how you want to use the system is kind of important. If you get that right, then you'll have a fantastic time with it. I know that there will be people who want to comment about which system is better. Please don't do that. Respect other people's opinion. No one system is the answer to everyone's prayers. And unfortunately, until we get a little bit further down the track and the technology continues to evolve and mature, I don't think we'll be in that position for quite a long time. And those little areas of innovation and differentiation between particularly the HD vendors will continue for the foreseeable future. It's how they differentiate and add value to their customers and attract new customers in. As I said, when we're looking at the slides, I think the majority of new HD pilots will be coming, of course, from that analog pool, but I think that for a time to come, until particularly the Whoop situation is fixed, lots and lots of people will still end up in that I fly both category for the foreseeable future too. Thank you for watching my video. Check out the playlist, and adding Pedantry 60 to your search terms will help you find my content. If you haven't done so already, please hit the like and subscribe button. It helps a lot. You can support the time I spend here answering questions and helping others by using the links in the video description.